Hi, I'm George Dahl. Welcome back to my film journal. 1981 was the year of the wolf. This was the year that two famous werewolf films clawed their way onto the silver screen. John Landis's An American Werewolf in London and Joe Dante's The Howling, as well as a third wolf-themed horror picture that sits less comfortably with the two, but often gets lumped in anyway. Michael Wadleigh's Wolfen, starring Albert Finney, Diane Verona, and Edward James Olmos. This movie is the product of two very interesting characters, the film's director, Michael Wadleigh, and the author of the book on which it is based, Whitley Streiber. Let's get started. Wolfen begins with a visit to a less familiar side of New York City, a desolate, hollowed-out wasteland of bricks and rebar. In the same way the title appears after a derelict building is reduced to rubble, so do the eponymous creatures of the film. The Wolfen, a sort of cryptid superintelligent wolf, are lashing out as the encroaching gentrification of urban decay is decimating their habitat. We are whisked away to the more glamorous side of the city and find ourselves in the limo of a wealthy real estate developer and his wife, who stop off to saunter around in what they think is an empty park, unaware of something stalking them, silently in the night. Until it's too late, of course. After the opening hook bloodbath, we're introduced to Albert Finney's character of Detective Dewey Wilson. He's running off what looks like a heavy hangover and is called in to investigate the high-profile murders. Were they simply a mugging? The motivated act of enemies or terrorists? There is much deliberation for most of the first act around what the cause of death could be.
You know how every piece of metal, no matter how sharp or smooth, will leave a residue when it cuts? Could be as finite as dust. Soft X-ray should pick it up. Nothing.
Now, we never see the grievous wounds of the victims, save for the severed hand of the bodyguard. I'm not an expert, but I would think that if one were mauled by an animal of some kind, there would be pretty obvious evidence of bite marks. And why do I say animal? Well, we all paid to see a movie called Wolfen with a big wolf head on the poster, and in the initial killing scene, we assume the point of view of something that is obviously a four-legged prowler with crazy night vision, a pretty cool effect that predates McTiernan's Predator by about 6 years, by the way. So it's kind of a miracle, then, that minor plot vagaries aside, the movie manages to keep you engaged throughout the investigation process as the police officers pursue every possible lead. Even though, come on, we know the wolves did it. We get a great star-turn performance by Albert Finney, lots of excellent little casual asides from his character.
How's it going? Identification. My face. I need credentials. All that separates you from a guard dog is a brain. Okay, Captain? Good dog.
And he and his big hair really command the screen. I love the choice to have Finney constantly eating during gruesome moments in the morgue, investigating dead bodies at a crime scene, or munching a hot dog while listening to Neff describe the torture techniques of various terrorist organizations.
The unomondo, they slash off the male genitalia. The cock and balls, they stuff them in their victim's mouth.
This display of nonchalant apathy towards the grotesque really helps sell the violence and threat of the Wolfen when even the hardened Detective Dewey starts to lose his nerve in their midst. Diane Verona's character of Neff is brought in as an earnest professional foil to the conservative and slovenly Wilson.
God, guns, and guts made America. Let's keep all free.
And to examine the possible terrorism angle of the crime, a subject we're told she's an expert in. We even get an explanation for a scene with a high-tech lie detector setup for the pursuit of a culprit that is essentially a complete red herring.
The register's heat changes in the 8 to 12 micron range. Thermographic systems equipment, voice analyzers.
Now, when I put my critical analysis cap on while watching this film, I was thinking, okay, there must be a reason for all this misdirection given what I know about director Michael Wadleigh and his personal beliefs. Maybe he's trying to say something about the folly of human beings and their inability to understand the vengeful drive of nature. That we're all so wired into technology and removed from the ecology of our planet that we fail to see the obvious. But I guess I was wrong about that because Wadleigh himself called the scene a red herring, and one he allegedly wanted to cut from the movie, claiming the studios only wanted to keep it in because of the intrigue around the recent assassination attempts of President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. You see, Wadleigh turned in a 4.5-hour edit of the film to Warner's and was unsurprisingly told to go pound sand. He ended up winning a lawsuit, though, against the studio as they apparently waived his contractual right to have a small test screening of his preferred 4.5-hour cut, and so he was awarded $20,000. However, when the movie flopped, and having bit the hand of the studio, no pun intended, Wadleigh never worked in Hollywood again. And in Warner's defense, the film's producers claimed that Wadleigh's insistence on the rights to Final Cut hindered the ability of the studio to successfully distribute the film by its expected release date, therefore securing it as a flop. So yes, despite being an Academy Award-winning director, this was Wadleigh's first and last narrative feature film made in Hollywood. He was most famous for being the director of the Woodstock documentary in 1970. And looking at his filmography, I was kind of confused. Like, how did this guy Wadleigh go from being the cinematographer on Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, the Scorsese picture, to being the director of the Academy Award-winning Woodstock documentary, to not doing anything at all for 10 years, and going from that hiatus to directing a big-budget studio horror picture based on a popular book? Well, it turned out Wadleigh himself said he lived simply. He lived in a $30,000 house in Los Angeles and basically just thrived on the residuals from Woodstock, spending all of his time in the intermittent decade writing what he called An American War and Peace, a 4.5-hour epic film based on the American Revolution. And apparently it caught the eyes of some studio execs who liked the story and ended up kind of liking Wadleigh himself. And their thinking was, hey, let's bring this guy in to shoot this horror movie, Wolfen, and we'll test his chops. It may not be a classic, but it's a great showing from a first-time director. I really wish we were able to see The Long Cut, and I really wish I could have seen his American Revolution movie. Wadleigh himself was seemingly perplexed by his inability to make the movie as he wanted it, considering he had similar studio disputes about the length of Woodstock, but had emerged victorious and vindicated with his lauded 3-hour cut. I imagine Wadleigh sees himself much in the way that Dewey and the coroner Whittington, played by Gregory Hines, are portrayed in their introductory scenes. Dewey is unkempt. He just rolled out of bed, and Whittington is dressed casually, jamming out to his music, but both are tolerated and respected by the stuffy, suited top brass of the city because they are both acknowledged to be the best at what they do.
You've got your best man here already.
So their unconventional nature is given a pass. I say all this to offer context to my review and to couch any assumptions I may make about this movie and its themes, because what we're seeing when we pop in the DVD is a studio cut from editor Richard Chew, one of the editors brought in by Lucas to save Star Wars, and not necessarily the autorial vision of Michael Wadleigh. So I guess we have to take any autorial claims with a grain of salt. However, one thing we can be fairly sure about in analyzing are the environmentalist themes of the film. Environmentalism has been an animating idea for Wadleigh throughout his career. Not only has he spoken openly about it, but if you look at his Twitter page, it's basically all he tweets about. And he's kept himself busy over the years producing documentaries for nonprofit organizations and NGOs while lecturing university students about climate change and writing a 1,000-page treatise from the point of view of an alien diagnosing humanity's climate problems. All this is not to say that Whitley Streiber's novel is free from environmental concerns, but it's less blatant. Streiber and Wadleigh, though, I'm sure would have had a productive conversation about global warming, considering Streiber's promising career as an up-and-coming horror novelist in the early 80s, being compared often to Stephen King and John Ferris, was abruptly cut short after an alleged visit by aliens, an experience he wrote about in his book Communion in 1987, which you can find in the nonfiction section, which was adapted into a film starring Christopher Walken playing an author modeled after Streiber, whose life is upended as he is plagued by interstellar visions. In fact, Roland Emmerich's 2002 film The Day After Tomorrow is based on a story by Streiber, one he claimed was communicated to him by aliens who warned him of impending ecological catastrophe, and it was documented in the book The Coming Global Superstorm, which he wrote alongside conspiracy theorist King and radio personality Art Bell in 1999. So we have two very interesting and prophetic personalities, Wadleigh and Streiber, coming together to create a fun little monster movie in Wolfen. When adapting the book to screen, Wadleigh took many liberties from a plot perspective, but nothing that really compromises the essence of the story. For instance, in the book, Neff and Wilson are already established partners, there's a love triangle subplot with Neff's husband who is maybe a crooked cop, and there really isn't a lot of deliberation about who or what is killing the victims. They pretty much arrive at the conclusion that it must be a wolf or a dog or some kind of animal by the end of Chapter 1. However, the biggest change from the novel to screen is the motivation of the Wolfen. In the novel, the Wolfen are characters we spend more time with. Streiber writes about them from a third-person omniscient perspective, so while they don't speak or communicate in a traditional way, we understand their methods, motivations, and thought process. The story is kicked off by the murder of 2 rookie police officers patrolling the city dump who are eaten by 2 young and inexperienced Wolfen. This causes much distress within the pack. They are smart enough to know that these cops were the wrong victims, that their death will draw unwanted attention, more than, say, the killing of a derelict, which was their traditional meal. But in the movie, the Wolfen are engaged in targeted attacks on people who threaten their habitat, namely the real estate developer from the film's opening, who is planning to build a big high-rise in the abandoned part of the city. This environmental perspective is Wadleigh's biggest contribution to the story, the idea of humans encroaching on wildlife. This element is played up in the Native American subplot and Edward James Olmos's role of Eddie Holt, the disaffected Native American activist who, after having run-ins with the law, ostensibly has gone straight. Initially, Neff and Wilson investigate Eddie from the terrorism angle, but as the continued unexplained and savage killings begin to weigh heavy on Wilson's mind, it seems as if he even starts to suspect that maybe Eddie might be transforming into a wolf, and the audience is drawn into this assumption as well. And Eddie plays up this angle, essentially to mock Wilson and his ignorance and superstition around Native Americans.
Told you, man. It's all in the head.
The Red Power movement and Indian rights activism was big in the 1970s, and awareness of Native Americans and their struggle was omnipresent, from Richard Oakes' 2-year occupation of Alcatraz Island in the early 70s, in which cultural influencers like the band Crosby, Stills, and Nash sent them a literal boatload of supplies, to the 71-day occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1973, which ended in the deaths of 2 Sioux tribesmen at the hands of federal forces. And of course, Marlon Brando's infamous 1973 Oscar stunt with Sacheen Littlefeather. And Wadleigh, a real deal hippie from the 1970s, innocently fetishizes the iconography of the Native American as a real natural human with close connection to nature, and this element is played up here in the film. However, Holt and the other Indians do appear to have a more preternatural connection, or at least an understanding of the wolves, than the white characters. Tom Noonan's character of Ferguson the biologist even laments the evolutionary transition that humans underwent that further separated them from their wolf counterparts.
Wolves and Indians evolved and were destroyed simultaneously. Their societies are practically one and the same. They're tribal, they look out for their own, they don't overpopulate, and they're superb hunters.
This suggests that the Wolfen are an avatar for a particularly interesting horror trope, that being the return of the repressed. This is a theme present in a lot of folk horror stories, that just beyond the village, in the forests of old, or on the moors, lurks something ancient that civilization has forgot about in all of their hustle and bustle. In this way, Wolfen has much less in common with the 2 other werewolf films of the year, and much more with a series of ecological animal attack films of the 1970s, culminating in 1979 with John Frankenheimer's Prophecy, a film which features Native Americans battling the pollution of their reservation by an upriver paper mill. It turns out, just as the Indians suspected, that runoff and mercury in the water is deranging the local flora and fauna, culminating in a standoff with a giant mutated bear. After an ill-fated encounter with the Wolfen in a derelict building where Gregory Hines is killed, and where the 20th century modes of Wolfen eradication, technology, and assault rifles fail, Wilson returns to the enclave of the Native Americans in a stupor, almost as if around a campfire. And whether he realizes it or not, he's there to seek their wisdom.
You got your technology, but you lost. You lost your senses. You don't have the eyes of the hunter. You have the eyes of the dead.
At the climax of the movie during the Wolfen's reign of terror, which tellingly takes place on Wall Street, the climactic appearance of the creatures is spectacular, backlit, ominous, their breath visible in the cold of night, and there's some great gore effects as the chief of police tries in vain to stand against them. Dewey and Neff retreat to the penthouse of the murdered industrialist, and in the moment of standoff between human and wolf, Dewey begins to understand as he regains his ancestral eyes of the hunter. This change is signaled by Dewey's seeming ability to see the Wolfen with the same visual sheen. He has acquired Wolfen vision, and the two begin to understand each other. Therefore, the Wolfen are not killed and defeated and banished. They are only mollified by Wilson's symbolic destruction of the construction plans that would decimate their home. Satisfied, they retreat, the specter of their return still hanging in the air, a warning to the humans not to expand civilization past its acceptable boundaries. Of the book, Wadleigh said, "I didn't like it, but I liked the premise, so I rewrote it as Moby Dick, a horror story sugarcoating around serious ecological issues. Before Columbus, there were 2 hunting tribes in America, 2 successful animals, Indians and wolves, who respected each other. There were 2 million wolves here in the 15th century, and now there are 200. At the end of my movie, Albert Finney faces the alpha wolf, harpoon in hand and a chance of blowing him away, but realizes a wolf is a creature of nature, and the detective is just a chained dog, and that man, not wolf, has formed the unjust society." Well, guys, thanks for watching. That was Wolfen, and I hope you guys have a happy Halloween and maybe make this movie part of the ritual of the year. It's a fun movie. There's a lot of exuberance in it, some great moments, excitement, and I think the style and the cinematography and the look of the movie is really captivating. Maybe check out a few of Whitley Streiber's books. I actually didn't know about the existence of this movie until I found this book at an old bookstore, and I looked it up, and I was like, wow, that looks interesting, and I checked out the movie. Some of his books are actually pretty good. The Hunger, which was made into a film by Tony Scott starring David Bowie and Susan Sarandon, is also worth checking out, and I think the book is pretty solid, too. They're available on audiobook. And let's give a shout-out, by the way, to Garrett Brown, the guy who invented the Steadicam in the late 70s. And his performance, essentially what I would call a camera performance in the movie, where, I mean, he's really using the Steadicam to play the Wolfen in the movie. He's jumping around, he's going through buildings, dipping and diving. It's a performance as the wolves. So I think that's a pretty interesting element of it too. Thanks again for watching, guys. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll talk to you next time. Happy Halloween.